The world knew David Bowie as the alien rock god with mismatched eyes, the androgynous revolutionary who shattered every rule of gender and performance. But in 1965, in a cramped Soho advertising agency called Neville Drake, a painfully shy 17-year-old boy named David Jones was carrying tea trays to creative directors who barely noticed him. His left pupil was permanently dilated from a childhood fight, giving him that strange, unsettling gaze that made people look away. The other office workers whispered about the weird kid who hummed strange melodies while photocopying client briefs, who dressed just a little too flamboyantly for a mailroom assistant, who seemed to be observing everything with those mismatched eyes as if he were studying humanity from the outside. What nobody in that building realized was that David Jones was already dead, and someone far more dangerous was being born in the shadows of those fluorescent-lit corridors. The boy serving Earl Grey to account executives was conducting an experiment in transformation that would eventually consume him completely, and the evidence of that metamorphosis was hiding in plain sight in the way he arranged the biscuits on the tray with theatrical precision, in the sketches he made during lunch breaks, in the persona he was building piece by piece while the advertising world taught him the most valuable lesson of his life: how to sell an illusion so convincing that even you start to believe it. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe now and join us on this journey through the moments that changed rock and roll forever. David Robert Jones was born on January 8, 1947, in Brixton, South London, into a world still recovering from World War II. His father worked as a promotions officer for a children's charity, while his mother had been a cinema usherette before marriage. The household was respectable, lower middle class, the kind of family that valued stability and discouraged dreams that reached too far. Young David was quiet, prone to daydreaming, and fascinated by the American rock and roll records his older half-brother Terry brought home. Little Richard, Elvis Presley, sounds that seemed to come from another planet compared to grey post-war Britain. Everything changed on a spring afternoon in 1962 when David was 14 and attending Bromley Technical High School. His best friend George Underwood was also interested in a girl named Carol Goldsmith, and when David made a move that George perceived as betrayal, the confrontation escalated with more emotion than sense. George threw a punch that connected directly with David's left eye, and while the boys made up almost immediately, the physical damage was permanent and profound. The punch had injured the muscles controlling the pupil's dilation, leaving David's left eye frozen in a permanently enlarged state that created the illusion of two different colored eyes, though both irises were actually blue. The condition, called anisocoria, gave him an unsettling asymmetrical appearance that made direct eye contact uncomfortable for others and turned him into an immediate target for bullying. Students called him Ghost Boy and Alien, words that stung but also planted a seed. What if being alien, being different, being not quite human was actually an advantage rather than a curse? During the long hospital visits and months of uncertainty about his vision, David started carrying a notebook where he sketched elaborate costumes and stage personas, characters who were deliberately strange, intentionally otherworldly, figures who would make his damaged eye seem like a mark of supernatural origin rather than teenage violence. He was already learning the fundamental principle that would guide his entire career. If you cannot hide your difference, weaponize it, transform it into your greatest strength, make people wonder if you're even from this planet at all. By the time he left school in 1963 at 16, David had formed several bands: the Conrads, the King Bees, the Manish Boys, each one slightly more experimental than the last. None achieved real success, and his parents grew increasingly concerned. His father insisted David needed a proper job, something stable that would provide income while he pursued music as a hobby rather than a fantasy. The compromise was that David would find work in a creative field where his artistic inclinations might be channeled into something commercially viable. And so, in early 1965, 17-year-old David Jones found himself sitting in the reception area of Neville Drake Advertising on Wardour Street in Soho, wearing his only suit and trying to look normal despite the eye that made him look like he was perpetually receiving transmissions from another dimension. Neville Drake Advertising was not prestigious. It was a mid-sized agency handling tobacco clients, household products, and occasional record label campaigns, the kind of place where young men learned the trade before moving on to bigger opportunities. The offices occupied the third and fourth floors of a building that had survived the Blitz but showed its age. The reception area smelled of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume, a combination David would forever associate with the peculiar desperation of people trying to sell things nobody actually needed. He was interviewed by a junior account manager named Michael Crawford, who seemed more interested in whether David could make decent tea than in his artistic ambitions or unsettling eyes. The job was the absolute bottom rung: office assistant, making tea and coffee, sorting mail, photocopying briefs, and essentially being invisible unless someone needed something. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover household expenses and bus fare. But David accepted immediately, because the alternative was factory work or retail. He started the following Monday, arriving 30 minutes early, terrified of losing this foothold in London's creative world. The creative director, Owen Frampton, father of future rock guitarist Peter Frampton, noticed David immediately, not because of his work ethic, but because of those eyes that seemed to look through you, and because David had a habit of lingering near brainstorming sessions, ostensibly to refill water glasses but actually absorbing every word with uncomfortable intensity. Frampton would later tell interviewers that David Jones was the strangest office assistant he'd ever supervised, not because he was incompetent but because he seemed to be conducting research, studying the agency with the focus of an anthropologist embedded in a foreign culture. What Frampton didn't fully understand was that David was indeed conducting research, and the subject was nothing less than the mechanics of desire and the architecture of illusion. Advertising agencies in the 1960s were laboratories of mass manipulation, places where creative professionals worked to identify human vulnerabilities and exploit them for commercial purposes. How do you make someone want a cigarette brand they've never tried? You associate it with rebellion, with dangerous masculinity that respectable society fears and young people crave. How do you sell soap? You create anxiety about body odor and social acceptability, then position your product as the solution to a problem you've just invented. David absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who understood they applied to far more than consumer products. If you could sell soap by creating a persona for it, why couldn't you sell yourself the same way? Why couldn't David Jones, working-class kid with a damaged eye and no prospects, become David Bowie, alien rock god from a planet where the rules of gender and identity didn't apply? Among David's regular responsibilities was operating the photocopier, a large temperamental machine occupying a small room on the third floor. This was considered one of the most tedious jobs in the agency, assigned to the lowest-ranking staff. But David approached it with intense focus because he understood that every document passing through that machine was a window into strategic thinking. He would arrive early to handle morning copying requests, often alone with stacks of creative briefs, campaign mock-ups, client feedback reports, and strategic planning documents that provided comprehensive education in how desire was manufactured and distributed at scale. The creative briefs were particularly valuable because they revealed the research and psychological profiling that preceded every campaign. Before the creative team started designing advertisements, the strategy department would produce detailed documents analyzing the target audience's demographics, psychographics, media consumption habits, fears, aspirations, and the emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited for commercial purposes. David would read these briefs carefully while the photocopier hummed, absorbing information about how different age groups responded to different appeals, how gender affected receptivity to various messages, how social class shaped aspirations and anxieties. One brief that particularly captured his attention targeted young men aged 16 to 25. His exact demographic, according to the research, young men in this bracket were experiencing unprecedented anxiety about their identities because traditional pathways to masculine success, factory jobs, military service, early marriage, were becoming less stable, but new models of masculinity hadn't yet emerged to replace them. These young men were hungry for figures who embodied alternative versions of what it meant to be male, who suggested that masculinity could be something other than the narrow, aggressive, emotionally constipated model their fathers represented. They were drawn to American rock and roll precisely because it offered a vision of masculinity that included emotional expression, physical beauty, and dangerous sexuality that felt transgressive without requiring them to actually transgress social norms in their own lives. David read this brief multiple times, each reading deepening his understanding that the persona he was building needed to address exactly these hungers and anxieties, needed to offer young men permission to be something other than what their culture demanded. The photocopier room also became a space where David experimented with his physical appearance in ways that would have been impossible in the open office. The room had a small mirror above the sink, and David would spend breaks in front of it trying different expressions, different ways of holding his face that either emphasized or de-emphasized his heterochromic eyes, different personas he could inhabit and discard like costumes. He practiced smiling in ways that made him look approachable versus dangerous. He experimented with holding his gaze steady instead of looking away, forcing himself to embrace the unsettling quality of his appearance instead of apologizing for it. He studied his own face with analytical intensity, identifying which angles were most flattering, which expressions created which emotional responses, how small changes in posture could completely transform perception. These sessions were the beginning of David's understanding that he was not just going to perform as a character, he was going to become that character so completely that the distinction between David Jones and David Bowie would eventually disappear entirely, and this dissolution would be both his greatest triumph and his most dangerous gamble. It was during his final months at the agency, in late 1965 and early 1966, that the specific seeds of what would become Ziggy Stardust were planted in David's imagination, though it would be nearly 7 years before those seeds fully germinated. The catalyst was a campaign the agency developed for a theatrical production company trying to attract younger audiences to experimental theater, and the creative brief explicitly used the phrase alien perspective to describe the kind of detached, observational stance the theater company wanted to cultivate. David was assigned to photocopy the campaign mock-ups, which meant he spent extended time studying images and text, describing this alien observer who moved through human society without fully belonging to it, who saw human conventions and behaviors as strange and arbitrary rather than natural. The concept resonated with David on a profound level because it articulated something he'd felt his entire life, the sense of being not quite human, of observing humanity from the outside, of performing the role of normal boy while knowing the performance was fundamentally unconvincing. But the theatrical campaign did more than resonate with David's existing feelings. It provided him with a framework for transforming those feelings into a marketable persona. If he positioned himself not as a failed human but as a successful alien, not as someone who couldn't conform but as someone who chose not to conform because he operated according to different rules and values, then his strangeness would become a strength rather than a liability. The alien observer concept solved a fundamental problem that had plagued all of David's previous musical projects. They had no clear identity or coherent mythology. They were just young men playing rock and roll like thousands of others. But an alien rock star, someone who explicitly positioned himself as being from another world with different assumptions about gender and beauty and behavior, that would be unique. That would be impossible to ignore even if many people found it threatening. David started developing this concept in his lunch break notebook, sketching not just costumes now but entire narratives about where this alien character came from, what his mission on Earth might be, how he would interact with human society. These early sketches contained many elements that would later appear in Ziggy Stardust: the androgynous appearance, the claim to be from space, the messianic overtones, the sense of being a messenger from a more advanced civilization that had transcended humanity's primitive obsession with binary gender. The other crucial element that crystallized during this period was David's understanding that the alien persona needed to be temporary and disposable, that it should have a built-in expiration date, creating drama and scarcity. This insight came directly from his advertising education, from observing campaigns that created artificial urgency by positioning products as limited-time offers or exclusive releases that wouldn't be available forever. David started thinking about his alien persona not as a permanent identity, but as a character he would inhabit completely for a specific period, and then deliberately destroy, creating a mythology of transformation far more powerful than simply maintaining the same persona indefinitely. This was radical in 1966 because rock stars generally maintained consistent personas throughout their careers, but David was envisioning something more theatrical and psychologically complex. A persona that would consume him so completely that killing it would feel like actual death, both for him and for his audience. David Jones left Neville Drake Advertising in March 1966, approximately 18 months after starting, and the departure was both inevitable and more wrenching than anticipated. By this point he'd become genuinely valuable to the creative team, and Owen Frampton had made clear there was a pathway to a junior creative position, possibly even a fast track given his obvious talent. The salary would have been substantially better than office assistant wages, enough to move out of his parents' house and live independently, enough to pursue music as a serious hobby without financial desperation. It was a genuine opportunity that many would have accepted gratefully, and David's parents certainly hoped he would because it represented stability and upward mobility. But David understood that accepting the promotion would mean abandoning the alien persona taking shape in his notebooks and imagination, choosing safety over the terrifying possibility of transformation. His final day was marked by a small goodbye gathering with supermarket cake and instant coffee and awkward workplace conversation. Owen Frampton took him aside to say the door would always be open if David changed his mind, a kind gesture David appreciated even as he knew with absolute certainty that he would never return. The advertising agency had taught David Jones how to create desire, manipulate psychology, sell illusions so compelling that people would mistake them for reality. Now he was going to apply those lessons to the creation and marketing of David Bowie. Between leaving the agency in 1966 and launching Ziggy Stardust in 1972, David Jones gradually became David Bowie through a series of incremental transformations testing different elements of the alien persona, without fully committing to any single version. He released his first album in 1967, which was a commercial failure but demonstrated willingness to experiment with theatrical elements. He studied mime with Lindsay Kemp, absorbing techniques that would become crucial to his stage presence. He formed experimental arts collectives, pushing further into performance art territory. None achieved commercial success, but each was a test case, gathering data about what worked and what didn't, preparing for the campaign that would eventually define his career. The breakthrough came in 1969 with Space Oddity, a song about an astronaut who becomes disconnected from ground control and floats away into space. And the timing was perfect because the BBC used it during Apollo 11 moon landing coverage, giving David his first genuine hit and establishing the space and alien associations that would become central to his public identity. Ziggy Stardust finally emerged in 1972 as the full realization of concepts David had been developing since his photocopier room days, and the persona was everything he'd planned: an androgynous alien rock star who claimed to be a messenger from space, who wore elaborate costumes and makeup making him look genuinely otherworldly, who performed sexuality and gender in ways so fluid and ambiguous they challenged fundamental assumptions about what men could be. The character was built on the Alien Observer framework from that 1965 theatrical campaign, but pushed far beyond anything advertising creatives would have dared propose to a commercial client. Ziggy was deliberately excessive, intentionally threatening to conventional sensibilities, designed to provoke strong reactions rather than appealing to the broadest possible audience, and the strategy worked spectacularly. Ziggy Stardust became a cultural phenomenon transcending music, a touchstone for an entire generation who felt alienated from mainstream culture and hungry for permission to be something other than what society demanded. But David had learned one more crucial lesson from advertising: the importance of artificial scarcity. Just as campaigns created urgency by positioning products as exclusive or temporary, David had always planned for Ziggy to have a definite endpoint. In June 1973, barely 18 months after Ziggy's debut, David shocked audiences by announcing during a concert at London's Hammersmith Odeon that Ziggy Stardust was finished, that this would be the character's final performance. The announcement was devastating for fans, but brilliant marketing because it ensured Ziggy would never become stale or overexposed, would never decline into self-parody. By killing Ziggy at the height of popularity, David created a mythology far more powerful than simply maintaining the character indefinitely, establishing a pattern that would characterize his entire career: the willingness to abandon successful personas and reinvent himself completely, rather than playing it safe. The story of David Jones at Neville Drake Advertising is not widely known outside devoted Bowie fans and music historians who've studied his early life in detail, and David himself rarely discussed it in interviews, perhaps understanding that revealing the calculated strategic thinking behind his personas might diminish their power and make them seem cynical rather than visionary. But the evidence of his advertising education is visible throughout his career in the way he managed his public image with the precision of a brand manager, in the way he understood and exploited media cycles and cultural moments, in the way he created artificial scarcity and manufactured desire rather than simply producing music and hoping for the best. The alien persona that made him famous was not a spontaneous expression of authentic self, but a carefully designed product that addressed specific psychological needs and cultural gaps. David had identified through research and observation. Ziggy Stardust was the advertising campaign that the boy in the photocopier room had been planning since 1965, refined over years of experimentation until the timing was right and execution was flawless. This revelation doesn't diminish David Bowie's artistry or cultural impact, but it complicates the narrative of the visionary artist who emerged fully formed. The reality is more interesting. David Bowie was created through a combination of genuine artistic instinct and professional marketing expertise, through years of study and strategic thinking that most rock performers never attempted. The weird kid with the damaged eye who carried tea trays understood something his contemporaries didn't: that in the modern media environment, the artist and the art are inseparable. that managing your persona is as important as creating your music, and that the rules of advertising and marketing apply to human beings just as effectively as they apply to cigarettes and cologne. Every rule he learned: create desire by identifying unmet needs, use repetition to build familiarity, leverage controversy for visibility, position yourself as unique and irreplaceable, create scarcity to increase value, was applied to the construction and management of David Bowie, and the result was one of the most successful artistic careers of the 20th century. David Bowie died on January 10, 2016, 2 days after his 69th birthday and the release of his final album Black Star, which was designed as his farewell and final transformation, his ultimate act of turning death itself into performance and art. But the strange boy with the mismatched eyes who carried tea trays in a Soho advertising agency 50 years earlier lives on in every artist who understands that creating great art requires not just talent and vision, but also strategic thinking about how to reach audiences and make them care. The legacy of those 18 months at Neville Drake Advertising is visible in every calculated controversy, every planned transformation, every moment when an artist treats their persona as seriously as their actual creative work. David Jones learned to sell illusions in that building on Wardour Street, and then he spent the rest of his life proving that the most powerful illusion you can sell is yourself, and that if you commit to that illusion completely enough, it stops being an illusion and becomes something far more real than reality itself. The T-Boy became the alien, and the alien changed the world, and it all started in an advertising agency where nobody suspected that the weird kid with the damaged eye was planning a revolution disguised as a rock and roll career.